The clock on the hospital wall read 3:17 a.m. Not the kind of hour when good things happen. Not the kind of hour when anyone walks into an ER with good intentions. Zola Rivers knew that. 6 years on the night shift had taught her the difference between the 3 a.m. that brought accidents and the 3 a.m. that brought consequences. The kind of consequences that wore expensive suits and arrived with bodyguards who stood too still and watched too carefully. She was a nurse. Teal scrubs, soft soles, braids pulled back, the kind of woman who moved through chaos like water, quiet, purposeful, impossible to ruffle, the kind of woman that the powerful and wealthy looked past without thinking twice. She was used to that. Invisible people see everything. He came in through the trauma bay doors like a king who had just lost his kingdom. Takeshi Kuroda. Pinstripe suit torn at the collar, a bruise blooming dark across his left cheekbone. Eyes wide, not with fear exactly, but with the particular alertness of a man who had survived enough ambushes to know that surviving one only meant another was already being planned. He was injured, he was exposed, and the way he stood, even hurt, even bleeding, made it clear that this was a man who had never in his life needed to ask anyone for help. He wasn't going to start now. But Zola wasn't asking for his permission. A Japanese mafia boss walked into her ER at 3:17 in the morning, beaten, betrayed, and completely alone. Drop a heart if you already feel what's coming. Takeshi Kuroda had survived wars that never made the news. But tonight, inside a hospital that was supposed to be the safest place in the building, his enemies were already closer than he knew. Hit that like and subscribe to Korean Mafia Tales, because Zola Rivers is about to see something that changes everything, and she has seconds to decide what to do about it. 3:17 a.m. The hallway outside Trauma Bay 3 was long, white, and fluorescent bright. Zola stood at the nurse's station 15 feet from Takeshi's room, updating charts. Around her, the ER hummed its usual overnight frequency, the low beep of monitors, the shuffle of tired feet, the occasional murmur of voices. Controlled, familiar, safe. She wasn't watching him anymore. She had 4 other patients. The job doesn't pause for one man, no matter who he is. Then she looked up. 2 men were walking down the hallway toward her, white coats, unhurried, side by side. Zola's eyes moved to them the way they always moved to anything that didn't belong. Not quickly, not obviously, just a quiet, practiced shift of attention that she had developed long before nursing school. She had grown up somewhere that taught you to clock a room before you relaxed in it. That skill lived in her now like a second heartbeat. She looked at their shoes. Dark, polished, not a single scuff. Nobody who worked a hospital night shift had shoes that looked like that. She looked at their badges, angled slightly inward, the way you'd wear one if you didn't want it red. She looked at their faces, and that was what settled it. In 6 years on this floor, she had never once seen a doctor walk this hallway with a face that gave away absolutely nothing. Doctors were always something, exhausted, focused, frustrated, relieved, always unmistakably human. These 2 men looked like they had surgically removed every human expression and replaced it with a single, quiet intention. They don't work here. The thought arrived the way the truest thoughts always do. Not as a question, but as a fact her body already knew before her mind caught up, and they are heading directly for his room. Zola set her clipboard down calmly, no sudden movements. She walked toward Bay 3 the way she always walked, steady, purposeful, a nurse going to check on a patient. She pushed through the curtain, stepped to his side. Takeshi's eyes snapped to her immediately, sharp, suspicious. The eyes of a man who had learned never to let anything approach him without measuring it first. She didn't flinch. She leaned in, close, the way the image on every screen would show it, her lips near his ear, her hand resting on his arm with practiced calm, her body angled to block the sightline from the hallway behind them. In the corridor over her shoulder, the two men in white coats were still coming, unhurried, inevitable. The clock on the wall behind them read 3:17. Zola's voice was barely a breath. "They're not here to help you." She tilted her head, just slightly, just enough. His eyes followed hers down the hallway. His jaw tightened, the way it tightens when a man recognizes something he has seen before and hoped never to see again. She held his gaze, direct, certain, calm. Run. She had every reason to stay quiet. Protocol, safety, the simple fact that this was not her world and not her war. But Zola Rivers noticed what nobody else did, and she chose. Drop a heart if that whisper just stopped your breathing. Subscribe to Korean Mafia Tales, because Takeshi Kuroda is about to discover that the most dangerous person in this hospital isn't carrying a weapon. She's in teal scrubs. It's 3:17 in the morning, and she just became the only thing standing between him and the ash circle. The escape starts now. The trauma bay doors burst open at 3:17 a.m., and Zola Rivers didn't look up right away. 6 years on the night shift had taught her that the entrance was never the important part. The important part was always what came through it. She heard the gurney first, then the voices, two men speaking in low, clipped tones. The kind of voices that were used to giving instructions and having them followed without question. Then silence from the rest of the ER. The particular silence that falls over a room when everyone in it simultaneously decides to mind their own business. That was when she looked up. He was sitting upright on the gurney, not lying down, not surrendering to it the way most patients did. Sitting. Back straight, despite the laceration visible through his torn pinstripe jacket. A bruise had bloomed dark and wide across his left cheekbone, and a shallow cut traced the edge of his temple. Dried blood tracking down toward his jaw. His white dress shirt was open at the collar, the expensive kind, and it was the only thing about him that looked undone. His eyes were moving, room to room, face to face, corner to corner. Not panicked, methodical. The eyes of a man running a calculation that had kept him alive for a very long time. Zola crossed the floor toward him with her clipboard, unhurried. Teal scrubs, braids pulled back. The soft authority of someone who had seen everything this room could produce, and remained standing. "I'm Zola," she said simply. "I'm going to take care of you tonight." He looked at her the way he had looked at everything else in the room. Measuring. She held his gaze without blinking and waited. Most people eventually looked away from a man like this. Zola didn't. Something shifted slightly in his expression. Not trust, not yet, but a hairline crack in the wall. His name was Takeshi Kuroda. She didn't know that yet. She knew his blood pressure was elevated, his pupils reactive, and his pain threshold was extraordinary, because he had not made a sound since entering the room. She knew his suit cost more than her monthly salary, and that the two large men positioned against the wall were not concerned relatives. She knew he was powerful, and she knew he was frightened. And she knew those two things rarely occupied the same man at the same time. She clipped the pulse monitor to his finger and began her assessment. Around them, the ER continued its low hum, monitors beeping, someone coughing in Bay 6, the PA system crackling with a name she didn't recognize. The ordinary machinery of a place built to hold crisis at arm's length. She wrote her notes. She checked his side. She did not ask him how he had gotten here or who had done this to him, because she had learned that some questions had answers that put the person asking them in danger. She should have held on to that instinct a little longer. She was at the nurse's station when she saw them. 3:31 a.m., 14 minutes since Takeshi had arrived. Zola was updating his intake chart, half her attention on the monitor behind her, half on the coffee she had not had time to drink. The hallway stretched long and white and fluorescent in front of her, the kind of lighting that flattened everything and hid nothing. Two men were walking toward her from the far end, white coats, side by side, unhurried. Zola's pen slowed on the page. She didn't stop writing. She had grown up somewhere that taught you never to let the wrong people know you'd noticed them. So she kept her eyes on her clipboard and let her attention do the real work, the quiet, practiced kind of attention that had nothing to do with looking. She clocked their shoes first. Always the shoes, dark leather, polished to a mirror finish. Not a single scuff, not a crease, not the compression across the toe box that came from 12-hour shifts on hard floors. Nobody who worked this hospital wore shoes that looked like that. Shoes like that belonged to men who sat, men who waited, men who arrived somewhere and then left quickly. She clocked their badges next, both angled slightly inward, faces turned toward their chests. In 6 years, she had never once seen a staff member wear their badge that way. You wore it outward, you wore it visible. That was the whole point. Then she made the mistake of looking at their faces. And that was what removed every remaining doubt. Blank. Completely, carefully blank. Not tired. She knew tired. Not focused. She knew focused. This was something else. This was the expression of men who had decided, before walking through the door, that nothing they encountered in this building was going to change what they had come here to do. They were 40 feet away, then 30, moving at exactly the pace of people who did not want to be remembered. Zola set her pen down. Quietly. No sudden movements. She thought about the protocol binder in the break room, about the charge nurse sleeping in the back office, about every reasonable and sensible thing a person in her position was supposed to do when something felt wrong. She thought about all of it in approximately 2 seconds. Then she looked at Bay 3. Takeshi was visible through the window, sitting up, still running his calculation, still surrounded by the beeping and the brightness of a room that had no idea what was walking toward it. A man who had survived everything his world could throw at him, now sitting completely still in the one place his enemies had counted on him being. 20 feet. She moved before she decided to. Down the hallway, steady pace, clipboard in hand, a nurse going to check on a patient. She pushed through the curtain. She stepped to the side of the gurney. She felt his eyes snap to her immediately, sharp, suspicious, the full weight of a man who trusted no one, landing directly on her face. She held it, didn't flinch. 15 feet. She leaned in close, the way the moment demanded, the way the image of this hallway would be frozen in both their memories forever. Her lips near his ear, her hand resting on his forearm, with a steadiness she didn't entirely feel. Her body angled deliberately to block the sightline from the corridor behind them. She could feel the tension in his arm beneath her hand, coiled, ready. 10 feet. Her voice was barely a breath, warm against the cold fluorescent air, certain in a way she had no right to be and no choice but to be. They're not here to help you. She felt him go still, a different kind of still than before. Not the stillness of a man in pain, the stillness of a man who had just heard something his body already knew. She tilted her head, just slightly, just enough. His eyes followed hers down the hallway to the two men in white coats, now close enough that she could hear the soft, deliberate rhythm of their footsteps on the linoleum floor. His jaw tightened. She met his eyes again, direct, unflinching, every protocol she had ever been trained to follow screaming at her from one direction, and something older and louder pushing back from the other. Run. For one full second, Takeshi Kuroda did not move. Zola felt it, the weight of a man deciding whether to trust something he had spent a lifetime training himself never to trust. A stranger, a civilian, a woman in teal scrubs who had just whispered words that could mean the difference between his life and his death, and who was asking him to follow her without explanation, without credentials, without anything except the steadiness in her eyes. The two men in white coats were at the curtain. Takeshi got up, not gracefully. His side was damaged, and she could see it cost him, but completely. No hesitation once the decision was made. That was the thing about men who had survived as long as he had. They were slow to decide and instant to act. Zola moved first, pulling the curtain back on the far side of the bay, the side that opened into the service corridor rather than the main hallway. She had used this route 100 times. Supply runs at 4 a.m., equipment transfers, the invisible infrastructure of a hospital that patients never saw. She knew every turn, every door code, every dead end. She heard the curtain on the other side open behind them as they slipped through. She didn't look back. She kept moving. The service corridor was narrow and low-lit, a different building entirely from the bright hallway they had left. Pipes ran overhead. The floor was bare concrete. Their footsteps were the only sound, and Zola kept hers soft, instinctive, while Takeshi matched her pace with a discipline that told her he had moved quietly through hostile spaces before. She turned left at the first junction, then right, then pushed through a heavy door marked "Authorized Personnel" into the stairwell. She stopped on the landing, back against the wall, listening. Footsteps above them. One set. Moving down. She grabbed Takeshi's arm without thinking and pulled him through the door marked B2, the basement level, the one that housed laundry, medical storage, and the auxiliary oxygen systems. The door closed behind them with a soft, final click. Takeshi looked at her in the dim light. For the first time since the trauma bay, his expression had shifted. Not fear. Something closer to recalibration. The look of a man encountering information that doesn't fit his existing model of the world. "You know this building," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. "Every corner of it," Zola said, already moving again. She led him through the storage corridor, past the linen carts and the sealed equipment bays, toward the far end, where the emergency supply room sat behind a keypad she had memorized on her first month of night shifts. She punched the code. The door opened. They were inside when they heard the stairwell door above them bang open. Both of them went still. Voices, two of them, low and clipped and moving with purpose. She heard them hit the basement landing, pause, then split. One set of footsteps heading left, one heading right toward the storage corridor, toward them. Takeshi's eyes moved to her. No panic, just the question. Zola was already scanning the room. The storage room held 3 industrial oxygen canisters against the far wall, a crash cart, 2 portable defibrillators, and a steel shelving unit stacked with supply boxes. Zola crossed to the oxygen canisters in 4 steps. Her hands moved with the muscle memory of someone who had handled these in actual emergencies, unhurried, exact. She didn't open the valve. She disconnected the primary coupling on the middle canister, just enough to create a slow, pressurized bleed. the kind that built quietly and then released with a sound like a door slamming when it finally gave way. Then she crossed to the shelving unit, looked at Takeshi once, and tipped it. The crash of steel and supply boxes hitting concrete exploded down the corridor like a gunshot. She heard the footsteps outside stop, then redirect, both sets now moving toward the sound, toward the far end of the basement, away from them. 3 seconds later, the oxygen coupling gave way completely. The canister shrieked and spun, careening off the wall in the darkness of the room, clattering and hissing and filling the corridor with noise. Zola was already at the door, pulling it open, moving. Takeshi followed without a word. They came up through the north stairwell, the one she had calculated the men hadn't covered, and emerged into the ground floor receiving corridor, the one that ran along the back of the building toward the loading dock. Takeshi was breathing harder now. His hand had moved to his side. She could see the injury pulling at him, the effort it was costing to keep pace, and she could see him refusing to acknowledge it with every step. She looked at him, really looked, and something about the sight of this man, this formidable, dangerous, solitary man pushing through pain because he had decided to trust her, landed somewhere in her chest that she hadn't expected. He glanced over and caught her looking. "Don't slow down," he said quietly. But his voice had changed. The suspicion was still there. It would probably always be there. But underneath it, something new had taken root, fragile and unfamiliar, the first thread of something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Zola faced forward and kept moving. The loading dock was 60 feet ahead. The loading dock was cold and dark and smelled of diesel and rain-wet concrete. Metal containers lined the far wall. A single fluorescent tube flickered overhead, throwing everything into uncertain light. Zola pushed through the heavy steel door first and held it, scanning left, then right, the way she had learned to move through this night, quickly, quietly, without announcing herself to anything waiting in the dark. Takeshi came through behind her. His breathing was controlled but shallow. His hand had not left his side. Then headlights cut across the far end of the dock. 2 black vehicles, moving without sound, rolling to a stop with the particular precision of people who had done this before. The doors opened before the engines died. 4 men stepped out, large, fast, already scanning, and when they saw Takeshi, something in each of them visibly reset. Not relief exactly. Soldiers confirming their principle was still standing. One of them spoke in Japanese, low and urgent. Takeshi answered in 3 words. The men fanned out immediately, 2 moving back toward the corridor doors, 2 staying with him. Behind them, somewhere in the basement, Zola heard the oxygen canister still hissing, then a shout, then running footsteps, retreating, she realized. The ash circle had heard the vehicles, had done the math, had chosen to dissolve back into the building's shadows rather than face what had just arrived. The loading dock went quiet. Takeshi turned to her. He stood in the flickering light with his torn suit and his bruised face, and the careful, contained expression of a man who had just experienced something he did not have language for yet. He looked at her the way you look at something that has permanently altered your understanding of a thing you thought you knew completely. She looked back at him with the steadiness that had carried her through the entire night. Teal scrubs, braids coming loose now, a clipboard she had left somewhere in the basement and wouldn't find until morning. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "No," she agreed. He held her gaze for a long moment, long enough that one of his men glanced between them and looked away. Then why? Zola considered the question the way she considered everything, without hurry, without performance. "Because it was right," she said simply, "and because somebody had to." Something moved across Takeshi Kuroda's face then, not gratitude, That word was too small for it. Something deeper. The particular expression of a man who has just discovered that a thing he stopped believing in a long time ago still exists in the world. He nodded once. It carried the weight of much more than a nod. Then he was gone, into the vehicle, into the night, and the loading dock was empty. And Zola stood alone in the flickering light and breathed for the first time in what felt like hours. 3 months passed. Zola worked her shifts. Teal scrubs, soft soles, clipboard. The ER continued its relentless rhythm, and she moved through it the way she always had, steady, precise, noticing everything. She didn't talk about the night of 3:17 a.m. There was no one to tell who would have believed her. And even if they had, it wasn't her story to give away. But things changed. Quietly. The way things change when someone powerful decides to care without announcing it. It started with the trauma wing. A donation arrived in October, anonymous, routed through 3 different foundations, but substantial enough to fund the state-of-the-art equipment the hospital had been requesting for 6 years. New monitors, a surgical suite that actually worked, lighting in the corridors that didn't flicker. The administrators sent a building-wide email calling it a blessing. Zola read it at the nurses' station and said nothing. Then her neighborhood. There was a man who had made her walk to the parking garage uncomfortable for 2 years. One Tuesday he was simply gone. Nobody on the block knew where. Then the broken streetlights on her route home were repaired, all 4 of them in a single week without any request to the city having been filed. Then the pharmacy on the corner that kept getting robbed stopped getting robbed. None of it was loud. None of it announced itself. It arrived the way Takeshi's men had arrived at the loading dock, without sound, without ceremony, already done. Zola understood. She looked up at the new trauma wing lighting on a Wednesday night shift and felt something she couldn't entirely name. Not comfort exactly, and not unease. Something in between. The knowledge that someone was watching, and that for once, being watched felt like being protected rather than exposed. She went back to her patients. She always went back to her patients. He came on a Tuesday morning in January, when the ER was quiet and the day shift had just begun, and the hospital looked the way it rarely looked, ordinary, unhurried, full of pale winter light. Zola was at the nurses' station when she saw him walking down the corridor. No torn suit this time, no bruise across his cheek. Dark coat, unhurried pace, the same careful eyes, but something in them had changed. The calculation was still there. It would always be there, but it shared space now with something that hadn't been present the night she'd met him. He stopped in front of her. "You look better," she said. "You look the same," he replied. It landed like a compliment. He set an envelope on the counter between them. She didn't open it. He didn't ask her to. "The trauma wing," she said. "The hospital needed it." "My street." "A precaution." She studied him. He let her. "You didn't have to do any of that," she said. His own words returned to him. The corner of his mouth moved, the smallest acknowledgement. "No," he said. And yet... Zola looked at the man standing across from her, powerful, damaged, altered in some way that violence hadn't managed, and one quiet night in a flickering loading dock had. A man who had spent his life believing that loyalty was purchased and humanity was weakness, standing in a hospital corridor holding neither a weapon nor a demand. Just presence, just accountability, just the quiet, unfamiliar weight of a debt he knew he could never fully settle and had decided to spend a long time trying. "The kids in the after-school program on the 3rd floor," she said finally. They need laptops. Takeshi reached into his coat pocket and produced a second envelope. Zola almost smiled. You already knew. I pay attention now, he said quietly. Someone taught me it mattered. He held her gaze one last time, the same way he had in the loading dock, carrying more than words could hold, and then he turned and walked back down the corridor the way he had come. Unhurried, purposeful. A different man wearing the same careful face. Zola watched him go. Then she picked up her clipboard, tucked both envelopes into her pocket, and went back to work. Because the job didn't pause. It never paused. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, the hallway felt a little safer. And she had learned, in the months since 3:17 a.m., that safety was not nothing. It was, in fact, everything.